Hi guys, alright, so today's video is going to be a little different. I'm going to talk about how I normalized my blood sugars for pregnancy. Again, I'm a type 1 diabetic, and to have a healthy pregnancy as a type 1 diabetic, the key thing is to keep your blood sugars as normal as possible. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how I did that. Now, of course, that's a huge topic, and there are a lot of things to say about it. So instead of going into all of the details, at least for this video, I'm just going to talk about what I would consider the essentials. I have a couple points that are absolutely essential, almost principles. And beyond that, I will perhaps do follow-up videos. If I see that people are interested, I can do videos on individual topics. So for today, I'm just going to talk about the principles, the things that I used to normalize my blood sugars. Now, before I get started, I want to say two really important things. The first is that I want to make sure that everybody who comes across this video knows that my intention with this video is not to convert anybody to my way of doing things. I am a firm believer that everybody has their own path in life. Each person, each type 1 diabetic has their own specific way that will work for them. So I'm not here as a crusader to try to bring you to my way or to tell you that what you're doing is wrong. It's not. I don't even know what's right and what's wrong. All I know is what I did and what worked for me. So I just want to make sure that you know that I support you and whatever you do, and this video is not about criticizing anybody else's method. Rather, it's just to tell my story and to explain to you how I was able to achieve normal blood sugars. The second thing that I want to say before I get started is that this is just my story. I'm not giving any medical advice. I'm not even qualified to give medical advice. So if that's what you're looking for, this isn't the video for you. Again, this is just my story and a very brief version of the story at that, just to give you the basics, the basic principles that I used to normalize my blood sugars. Okay, so just really briefly, what I mean by normal blood sugars is that of a non-diabetic. So most of you, I'm sure this doesn't sound like something that's possible. I know for me, I didn't think it was possible to have normal blood sugars, but it is. It's a lot of work. It's really hard, and it takes a lot of motivation. But I mean achieving normal blood sugars as if you're not diabetic. So keeping your blood sugars around the 80s and not letting it go above 120, and even when that happens, only rarely, and then also not getting a lot of low blood sugars. So I'm talking about normalizing blood sugars. So the first step to how I normalized my blood sugars, and it actually started several years before I was even thinking about becoming pregnant. However, becoming pregnant it's always been a dream of mine. So throughout the time I've been diabetic, I've always been on the hunt for better control because I knew that in the future I would get pregnant. But for me, the first ingredient, the first essential thing that had to happen was that I had to get to a point where I was desperate. I had to get to a point where I was really frustrated with my current care, and where I felt like I had hit a wall. This is important because if you don't feel frustrated with your blood sugars and you think you're fine and everything's working great for you where you're at, then you're not going to be able to do the very hard work necessary to have normal blood sugars. So the first ingredient was that I got to a point where I was really fed up with the results I was getting. Now, briefly, I'll just tell you that I was on the insulin pump for 10 years, and I had a carb to insulin ratio. For every 15 carbs, it was 1 unit of Novolog. I was using Novolog, fast-acting insulin. And I always considered myself a good patient in the sense that I always wanted to do everything the doctor said, not cheat too much. I wanted to follow doctor's orders because I wanted to have good blood sugar control. Now, despite my best efforts, I found that there was still just too much unpredictability. No matter what I did, even if I did everything, calculated everything I was eating, was really consistent with it, took exactly the right amount of insulin, I still had roller coaster blood sugars. That was my biggest problem, is that no matter what I did, it seemed, my numbers were either really, really high or really, really low. And if they were normal for any extended period of time, it was a fluke. It's like I would eat, and then inevitably you get a spike, and then you get a low. And when I would get low, I would correct the low and then have a really high rebound. Now, side note, the rebound effect, or the Samoji effect is what it's called in medical literature, I have discovered after finding this new way of treating my diabetes, it doesn't actually exist. It doesn't have to happen. Now, the rebound effect used to always happen to me every single time I was low. But now I've learned a new way to treat my lows, and I never, ever, not once in 5 years have I had a rebound. Even after having blood sugars as low as 30, I do not get rebounds. I can bring them right back up to 80, and they don't get higher than that. And maybe I'll talk about that a little later. It might be too much for this video. But, yeah, so I was on the insulin pump for 10 years. Like I said, I tried to do everything right, and I just was frustrated because my doctors would tell me that it was impossible not to have some degree of roller coaster. As a diabetic, that's the nature of the disease, they would tell me. Your pancreas does a better job of controlling insulin than we can, even with an insulin pump, so there's naturally going to be some variation there. It's some unpredictability. You're going to have more roller coasters than somebody without diabetes. And so that's the answer I was getting from my doctors, which is basically you're just going to have to live with it. And I wasn't satisfied with that. So what happened was I started doing a lot of searching for alternative ways of treating diabetes. And thank goodness I had a very strong advocate in my mother, who also helped me a lot in finding a way to manage my blood sugars. And it was actually through her, she randomly met somebody, a man who she saw wearing an insulin pump, and said, oh, there's another diabetic. So she went and talked to him, and anyway, through the conversation, it came up that he had found this book, which he called his diabetic Bible, and that it had changed his life. It had changed his blood sugar control. And the book he was talking about is this one right here. This is called Diabetes Solution, The Complete Guide to Achieving Normal Blood Sugars. It's by a doctor named Dr. Bernstein. She read the book, was impressed by how different the tone was. Like, it was totally different than anything we had heard from conventional doctors. He just had a completely different approach, like sort of the everything you've been taught about diabetes is wrong kind of approach. And like I said in the beginning, that's why you have to be really fed up with your current treatment in order to even consider something so radical, because this is pretty radical coming from a conventional sort of treatment. So anyway, she told me about the book. We got really into it. Within 3 months of following this doctor's guidelines that he lays out in his book, my A1C got down to 6.1, which at the time for me was a historic low. Since then, it's gotten even lower, but before that, the lowest A1C I had ever achieved was a 6.8. So after only 3 months of doing the stuff he talks about in this book, to have an A1C of 6.1, I was really encouraged, and early on convinced that this was something that I wanted to pursue, because they were the best results I had gotten from any method in 10 years. So, as you can see, it's a pretty thick book, and there's a lot of stuff that he talks about in here. And really, if you're interested in any of the stuff I'm about to talk about, your best bet is to read the book yourself, because, I mean, it changed my life. That guy my mom talked to, it changed his, and I know that people who are his patients, so he has a practice where he exclusively treats type 1 and type 2 diabetics, they're able to achieve A1Cs in the 4s and 5s, and he's one of the only doctors out there who can promise normal blood sugars. So yeah, I would suggest that you read this if you're interested in it. But I'm gonna talk about two main things in this book that I consider to be the principles that I live by now, and the two most important things that change the way I treat my diabetes and that lowered my blood sugar. So the first of those is the importance of a low carbohydrate diet. Now this one, when I first read about it, it was a totally new concept to me. I hadn't heard of it before. I mean, the conventional way to treat diabetics and the way I was being treated is to prescribe a relatively high carbohydrate diet. Now that's in part because our current nutritional guidelines have a very large emphasis on grains and carbohydrates as fuel. Like, our bodies need carbohydrates for fuel. And so the belief is that even a diabetic needs to have the same amount of carbohydrate as everybody else. However, in my experience, I have found that that's a little bit odd, because the price of that is that you have high blood sugars, and over time those high blood sugars give you long-term complications. So what's worse, reducing the number of carbs you eat, or living a life with elevated blood sugars where you develop complications? So anyway, another thing is the idea of eating a low carbohydrate diet. I suddenly started seeing diabetes in a different light. Almost as if diabetes, in a sense, is like having a food intolerance, and your food intolerance is to carbohydrates. I mean, the hormone that is essential to breaking down carbohydrates, insulin, your body doesn't produce. You have to inject it or take it with an insulin pump or something like that. And no matter how perfect you try to be, you can't replicate the pancreas. So there's just no way to cover carbohydrate in the same way that a fully functioning non-diabetic would. So I started seeing diabetes as like me having a carbohydrate intolerance, and so why not avoid the thing? You know, like people who have celiac disease, for instance, are told to avoid gluten, because if they eat gluten, then the result is excruciating pain, and so you avoid the gluten. Likewise, people who are lactose intolerant, you want to avoid lactose. Why not, as diabetics, why aren't we told to avoid carbohydrates? At least greatly reduce them. You know, maybe not everybody would be into eliminating them, but in my experience, any amount that you can reduce carbohydrate lowers your blood sugars. It's just natural. You know, what do you do if you have a low blood sugar? You need to bring it up. You eat carbohydrate. So that's the first principle that was essential. It's the first thing that I implemented, and it's what brought my A1C down to 6.1. Now, what Dr. Bernstein means by low carbohydrate and the way I eat is really no starch whatsoever. So it's not like it's less bread. It's no bread. No bread, no pasta, no rice, basically all the tasty things in life. But then also no starchy vegetables like potatoes, sweet potato, even peas. Green peas are pretty starchy and carby. So in his diet, you're getting all your carbohydrates from vegetables, leafy green vegetables, and I mean there's a long list of vegetables that are totally approved in this diet, and I think you get a well-balanced source of nutrients. And then also things like nuts and seeds are allowed in limited quantities. So low carbohydrate diet is absolutely essential. The second thing that he talks about in this book, and he does a much better job explaining it, and I'm going to try to explain it and hopefully you'll understand my poor explanation, and that is something called the law of small numbers. Now this was another game changer for me, because the law of small numbers teaches you how to think differently about the way you're eating and the way you're giving yourself insulin. What it means is, like any science problem or science experiment, you want to make your margin of error as small as possible. And the way you do that is by making your input numbers very small. So for example, if you eat 5 carbohydrates and you take a half a unit of insulin to cover the 5 carbohydrates, even if your calculation is off, it's not going to be off by a lot. Like a half a unit can't do that much to your blood sugar, either make it go too high or too low. So you've reduced the margin of error. If you eat large numbers of carbohydrates, 60, 70, 80 carbohydrates, you need a large amount of insulin. Therefore, if your calculation is off, even by just 10%, you're going to have a big margin of error. So your blood sugar could shoot to 250, or it could go so low, it could go to 50. Your margin of error increases. So this idea of small numbers is basically saying keep your life simple, like keep the numbers small, the number of carbohydrates small, the amount of insulin small, and you'll have much greater predictability. And you'll be able to get to your target blood sugar more easily. The last thing that I would say is a principle from this book is the importance of routine and predictability. Now, this might be, like the low-carb diet is pretty difficult because, like I said, all of the tastiest and oftentimes the most convenient foods are carby. But I think probably the hardest thing about this diet is how rigid your schedule has to be. And that's essential too. And if you're diabetic, you know what I mean. Like if you were to do, hypothetically, if you were to do exactly the same thing every day, your blood sugars would be better, because if you ate exactly the same thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you would know exactly how much to give yourself, how much insulin to give yourself, and you would know how your blood sugar would respond. So predictability is key. For example, what I do is I eat 3 meals a day and no snacks. Snacks tend to complicate things. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I always eat around the same time. So breakfast is between 7 and 8 in the morning, lunch is between 12 and 1, dinner is between 5:30 and 6, and for each meal every day, the part that's consistent is I eat the same amount of carbs and the same amount of protein. That doesn't mean I eat the exact food, but as long as it's a protein food, that's interchangeable. I eat 4 ounces of protein for breakfast, 6 for lunch, 6 for dinner. I eat 6 carbs for breakfast, 12 for lunch, 12 for dinner. And like I said, the foods you choose can change, but the number of ounces of protein and grams of carbohydrates remains the same. So yeah, my 3 principles: low carbohydrate diet, the law of small numbers, and then a consistent routine, like as consistent as possible. And just really quickly before I go, I do want to mention that the guy who wrote this book is a type 1 diabetic himself. And to me, that makes all the difference. One of my dreams was to find a doctor who was also a type 1 diabetic, because in my experience, there's just something you can't understand unless you have it. And even the best endocrinologist, most well-intentioned endocrinologist, you just can't fully understand it unless you live with the disease yourself. And this guy was diagnosed back in the 1940s. He's old now, he's in his 80s. And by the time he was in his 20s and 30s, he was literally dying because of complications from high blood sugars. He had advanced kidney failure and some heart problems. I mean, he was literally dying. And so he got so desperate that he came up with this method of how to normalize his blood sugars. And that's what this book is about. He actually became a doctor. He went to medical school after he discovered how to normalize blood sugars, because nobody in the medical community would take him seriously because he wasn't a doctor. He's one of the only doctors I've found who advocates for low carbohydrate diet. He has consistently been on the cutting edge of diabetes medicine. For example, he was probably the first person to do glucose monitoring at home. And he was definitely the earliest advocate for making that mainstream. The blood glucose monitor like we all use, that was him. And then also the A1C, using the A1C as a diagnostic tool for diabetes, that was also something that he was a pioneer on. He pushed for that early on before it was standard to do that. So he's a pretty awesome guy. He's got a really cool story, which he talks about in the book. And just in case you were wondering, no, I'm not being paid to promote the book. He doesn't even know that I'm doing this video. It's just, it was life-changing for me. And if you really are interested in how I got my A1C to be so low and to have normal blood sugars, this is an essential read. But for now, this video has gotten way out of hand. It's super long. Sorry about that. If you've made it till the end, thank you. As always, if you have any questions, just please leave them in the comments and I will respond to you. And until then, I will see you in my next video, which will be my 10-week pregnancy update. I can't believe it's already 10 weeks. And yeah, if you want me to do more specific videos about diabetes-related topics, I can totally do that too. So yeah, that's it for today, and thanks again for watching. I will see you all in my next video. Bye!